Teens behind bars, death row, and life sentences. Imagine being just 12, 13, or 14 years old, and instead of thinking about school or friends, you're facing a death sentence or life in prison. These aren't horror stories, they're real cases of teens condemned by the justice system before they ever had a chance to grow up. On this episode of Legends of Black Excellence, we uncover the shocking truths behind America's youngest inmates on death row. Some were victims, others were monsters in the making, but all were children. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with us, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about justice. George Stinney Jr. In the Deep South during the Jim Crow era, where racial prejudice was embedded into every corner of life, a 14-year-old boy named George Stinney Jr. became the youngest individual executed in the United States in the 20th century. Standing only 5 feet tall and weighing just 90 pounds, George was hardly more than a child. Yet the legal system treated him as a man, swiftly condemning him without the slightest regard for fairness, evidence, or basic rights. It was March 24, 1944, in the small mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina, when the bodies of two white girls, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 8, were found in a ditch. They had been brutally beaten with a railroad spike. The community's response was immediate. They needed someone to blame. Within hours, George, a black boy from a working-class family, was arrested. His only known connection to the victims was reportedly speaking to them earlier in the day about where to find wildflowers. From that point on, the wheels of injustice turned at a horrifying pace. George was interrogated by several white officers alone without his parents, a lawyer, or any advocate present. Despite the lack of any written or signed confession, authorities claimed he admitted to the killings. No physical evidence linked him to the crime, and yet the town was quick to accept this alleged confession as absolute truth. George's trial, held just a month later on April 24th, was a sham. His defense attorney, Charles Plowden, was a tax commissioner with no experience in criminal law and little interest in mounting a real defense. He called no witnesses and offered no meaningful cross-examination. The jury, all white men, deliberated for barely 10 minutes before finding George guilty. He was sentenced to death by electric chair. On June 16, 1944, just 81 days after his arrest, George was led to the execution chamber. He was so small that the adult-sized electric chair could not fit him properly. He had to sit on a Bible as a booster seat. Witnesses reported that the electrodes didn't stay in place due to his size, and his tiny body convulsed violently when the current surged through him. What makes George's story even more horrifying is the lack of effort to verify the facts. No transcript of his supposed confession existed. No appeal was filed. His family was threatened and forced to flee town under fear of mob violence. In truth, George Stinney Jr. never stood a chance against a system built to protect white citizens and suppress black ones. It wasn't until 70 years later, in December 2014, that a South Carolina judge, Carmen Mullen, vacated his conviction. In her ruling, she cited a great injustice, emphasizing the absence of a fair trial and the likelihood that George's confession had been coerced. Legal scholars and historians praised the decision as a necessary, though long overdue, acknowledgement of one of the darkest miscarriages of justice in American history. George's execution became a powerful symbol of racial oppression and the perils of trying juveniles as adults without due process. His case is frequently cited by legal reform advocates as a reason why minors should not face capital punishment. In life, George had no voice, but in death, he became a rallying cry. Today, his name is a reminder of a society that once condemned a child without mercy or truth. It forces us to reflect how many more were silenced by similar systems, and how do we ensure such a tragedy never repeats. George Stinney Jr.'s story is not just a tale of a boy lost, it is a lesson etched into the conscience of a nation. Paula Cooper. In 1985, Paula Cooper, a 15-year-old girl from Gary, Indiana, committed a crime so brutal that it sent shockwaves across the nation. But her story didn't end in the courtroom. Instead, It ignited a global debate on justice, mercy, and the treatment of juvenile offenders. From being the youngest person on Indiana's death row to becoming a symbol of redemption, Paula's journey was a harrowing intersection of violence, rehabilitation, and societal transformation. On May 14, 1985, Paula and 3 friends devised a plan to rob 78-year-old Bible school teacher Ruth Pelkey. They knocked on the elderly woman's door under the pretense of wanting religious instruction. Once inside, what followed was an act of savagery that horrified the community. Paula stabbed Mrs. Pelk 33 times with a 12-inch butcher knife while the other girls ransacked the house. Their total loot, a mere $10 and the keys to the victim's car. The callousness of the act, its brutality, and the insignificance of the gain fueled public outrage. When Paula was sentenced to death in 1986, she was just 16 years old, becoming the youngest inmate on death row in the United States at that time. The verdict ignited a firestorm of international protest. Religious leaders, activists, and human rights organizations condemned the sentence, arguing that executing a teenager regardless of her crime was a moral failing. Among the most notable voices was Pope John Paul II, who made a direct appeal for clemency. Over 2 million people worldwide signed petitions demanding that her life be spared. In 1989, the Indiana Supreme Court relented, commuting her death sentence to 60 years in prison. This decision reflected a broader reevaluation of how America treats juvenile offenders. During her incarceration, Paula underwent a transformation that would redefine how many viewed her. She earned a GED, studied at Ball State University through a prison education program, and eventually received a college degree. More importantly, she became a mentor and tutor for other inmates, choosing to contribute positively to the world she was confined in. The most unexpected development came from the victim's family. Bill Pelkey Ruth's grandson initially sought the harshest punishment, but over time he experienced a profound change of heart. After reading about Paula's remorse and progress, he forgave her. Not only did he forgive her, he advocated for her release. He believed his grandmother, a devout Christian, would have chosen compassion over vengeance. Bill later co-founded Journey of Hope, an anti-death penalty organization that fights for alternatives to capital punishment. After serving 27 years, Paula Cooper walked out of prison on June 17, 2013, at the age of 43. Her release marked a significant moment in criminal justice reform, not just because she was free, but because her story had fundamentally altered how Indiana and much of America viewed juvenile crime. Tragically, freedom proved fleeting. Less than 2 years later, on May 26, 2015, Paula died by suicide in Indianapolis. Her death devastated many who had followed her journey. To some, it raised difficult questions about the psychological toll of incarceration, especially for those sentenced at a young age. To others, it was a stark reminder that redemption, while powerful, cannot always undo deep-rooted trauma. Paula Cooper's life was defined by extremes, heinous violence, sweeping redemption, public condemnation, and global compassion. Her story challenges society to consider not just what justice looks like, but what mercy demands. Was she a monster, a child lost, or a woman who paid her debt and tried to rebuild? The answer, as with many such cases, lies not in absolutes, but in the uncomfortable complexity in between. Lionel Tate. In the late 1990s, the name Lionel Tate became synonymous with a legal and moral dilemma that divided America. How should the justice system treat children who commit deadly acts? At just 12 years old, Lionel was charged with a crime so severe that he would go on to become the youngest person in the United States ever sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence that sparked outrage, debate, and eventually legal reform. Born in 1987, Lionel was left alone one night in July 1999 at his home in Broward County, Florida, with 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, whom his mother was babysitting. What began as play fighting mimicking wrestling moves Lionel had seen on television ended in tragedy. Tiffany died from catastrophic injuries, including a fractured skull, broken ribs, a lacerated liver, and internal bleeding. A forensic pathologist later compared the trauma to the force of a 3-story fall. Lionel claimed he never intended to harm her, but the severity of Tiffany's wounds told a different story. Prosecutors initially offered a plea deal, 3 years in juvenile detention and 10 years of probation. But Lionel's legal team rejected the offer, believing they could win at trial. That decision proved devastating. In 2001, at the age of 13, Lionel was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The verdict stunned the public and ignited a fierce national discussion. Was it justice served or justice denied? Critics argued that Lionel, a child at the time of the incident, lacked the mental capacity and understanding to be held to the same standards as an adult. They pointed out that he had no prior criminal record and that the killing lacked premeditation. Advocates for reform, including international human rights organizations, highlighted the case as a glaring example of the flaws in America's approach to juvenile justice. The public pressure paid off. In 2004, an appeals court overturned the conviction, citing that Lionel's mental competency had not been properly assessed before his trial. He was released after agreeing to the original plea deal, which now included 1 year of house arrest and 10 years of probation. The ruling was seen as a step toward balancing justice with compassion for youth. But Lionel's release marked the beginning of a troubling spiral. Just months later, he was arrested for violating probation by being caught with a knife. In 2005, things escalated further when he was charged with the armed robbery of a pizza delivery man. While awaiting trial, he was again found in possession of a firearm, another violation. These repeated offenses signaled to the courts that he was either unable or unwilling to reform. In 2006, Judge Joel Lazarus had seen enough. He sentenced Lionel to 30 years in prison for violating probation, famously telling him, "You've run out of chances." The hopeful image of a troubled youth who might turn his life around had darkened into one of repeated criminal behavior and missed opportunities. Lionel's case remains a poignant example of the complexities involved in prosecuting minors for severe crimes. It continues to be cited in legal and academic circles as a case study in juvenile sentencing, mental health assessment, and media influence, particularly concerning children exposed to violent entertainment. Today, Lionel Tate remains incarcerated, his life shaped by one fatal night in 1999 and a series of choices both legal and personal that followed. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Can rehabilitation truly follow a childhood tragedy? Should minors ever be treated as adults in the eyes of the law? And how many young lives are we willing to write off without exploring deeper solutions? Lionel Tate is more than a cautionary tale. He is a reflection of the justice system still struggling to reconcile punishment with understanding when it comes to its youngest defendants. Christa Pike. At just 18 years old, Christa Gale Pike committed a murder so gruesome, so senseless, that it stunned the nation and sent her straight to death row, making her the youngest woman in America facing execution at the time. Unlike other teenage offenders whose crimes raised questions of trauma or neglect, Christa's case chilled even seasoned investigators due to the sheer brutality and coldness with which it was carried out. In 1995, Christa was enrolled in the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee, a government-run initiative designed to help troubled youth build vocational skills and reintegrate into society. But instead of finding purpose or support, Christa spiraled into a toxic relationship with fellow student Tatterell Shipp and quickly developed a violent, obsessive streak. Fueled by jealousy, suspicion, and a desire to assert dominance, she became fixated on another 19-year-old student, Colleen Slemmer. Believing Colleen was interested in her boyfriend, Christa decided to eliminate her perceived rival in the most horrific way imaginable. On January 12, 1995, Christa Tatterell and a third accomplice lured Colleen into a secluded wooded area near the University of Tennessee. What happened next lasted between 30 minutes to an hour, and was described by authorities as pure sadism. Colleen was beaten, slashed, and had a pentagram carved into her chest. Christa and her accomplices used a box cutter and a small meat cleaver in the assault. The fatal blow came when Christa crushed Colleen's skull with a large chunk of asphalt. She then kept a piece of Colleen's skull as a trophy, and later bragged about the murder to her peers. When police arrested Christa, she offered a full confession, uncoerced and chillingly detailed. She showed no remorse. In fact, she smiled while discussing the events, displaying an unnerving detachment from the horror she had inflicted. At her trial in 1996, her attorneys revealed a deeply troubled background. A childhood marked by neglect, parental substance abuse, and early exposure to violence. Psychological evaluations diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder and suggested she suffered from delusions and extreme emotional instability. But the jury was unmoved. The gruesome nature of the crime, combined with Christa's own words and demeanor, led to a swift conviction. At just 20 years old, she was sentenced to death, the youngest woman on death row in the United States at the time. Unlike many others in similar positions, her age and psychological condition failed to sway the court's decision. Her time behind bars has done little to convince authorities that she has changed. In 2001, Christa attempted to strangle a fellow inmate with a shoelace in a failed escape attempt. The attack left her victim hospitalized and added an attempted murder charge to her record. This incident further solidified her reputation as a continuing threat. Now, nearly 3 decades into her sentence, Christa remains on death row at the Tennessee Prison for Women. Legal battles have continued over the years, with her defense arguing that her mental health issues should be grounds for mercy. Yet the courts have consistently upheld her sentence, citing the cruelty of the murder and her own confessions as evidence of her dangerousness. Christa Pike's story forces society to confront uncomfortable questions. Can mental illness explain away monstrous acts? Does youth mitigate unspeakable violence? And at what point does justice become irrevocable? Her name remains etched in the annals of American criminal history, not as a misunderstood child, but as a teenager who crossed a terrifying line and never looked back. Curtis Jones. In the summer of 1999, a heartbreaking case unfolded in Florida that shook the nation. 2 children siblings, Curtis, 12, and Catherine Jones, 13, were thrust into the harshest glare of the justice system after killing their father's girlfriend. Their story, far more than a simple tale of juvenile crime, illuminated a darker reality. Children who commit violence are often products of long-standing suffering hidden from view. Curtis and Catherine had been living under the same roof as their father, along with his girlfriend Sonia Spates. In the years leading up to the incident, they allegedly endured sexual abuse at the hands of a family member. These cries for help, whispered and overlooked, went unheeded. With no official investigation or intervention, their emotional wounds deepened. The siblings were left feeling abandoned by the very systems and caretakers meant to shield them. The fatal night came when fear reached a tipping point. Believing they had no other recourse, Curtis and Catherine retrieved a firearm and confronted Sonia in an act born of desperation. In the aftermath, they fled, but not for long. The legal machinery launched its response. Charged with first-degree murder, the siblings faced the stark reality of life spent in prison with no chance of early release. Yet beneath the courtroom's severity lay a juvenile tragedy fueled not by malice, but by trauma. Behind the veneer of criminal labels, there were deeper truths. Court documents later revealed a history of sexual mistreatment. Social workers had detected signs of distress long before the killing, but bureaucratic inertia and family secrecy allowed the abuse to continue. The justice system, trained to pursue crime, was ill-equipped to address the human suffering at the heart of this case. In a plea agreement, Curtis and Catherine accepted responsibility for second-degree murder. The deal carried a sentence of 18 years in prison, followed by lifetime probation. For Curtis, this meant his formative teenage and young adult years would be spent behind bars, reshaping his identity within prison walls. For Catherine, It meant navigating adolescence in institutions designed for punishment, not healing. Curtis's journey inside prison was one of quiet transformation. Though the environment was stark and unforgiving, Curtis sought solace and purpose. Schooling became a means to find meaning. He pursued education, discovered faith, and eventually became an ordained minister. His ordination symbolized a profound shift from victim to spiritual guide, from lost child to leader. His voice, once silenced by trauma, now offered compassion and hope to others. Catherine's path mirrored the same complex mix of regret, resilience, and recovery. Despite enduring incarceration during a developmental phase of life, she gradually embraced introspection. Letters therapy and faith helped her process the years of abandonment and violence that had shaped her decisions. Separated from her brother due to institutional rules, she nonetheless found a way to regain herself piece by piece. In July 2015, both siblings walked free. Curtis emerged at age 28, carrying the mantle of spiritual leadership and a message rooted in the pain he had endured. Catherine, now a young woman, stepped into the world with scars, emotional, psychological, and legal, but also with a profound understanding of survival. Their release did not bring fame or grand accolades. Instead, Curtis and Catherine retreated into quiet lives, choosing introspection over public spectacle. But their story left a lasting mark. It forced society to examine not just criminality, but victimhood, institutional failure, and institutional redemption. The case of Curtis Jones asks, what do we owe to children who commit grave acts, punishment, rehabilitation, or protection? Curtis's evolution suggests that early intervention, mental health support, and education can change the course of a life, even one that has veered into darkness. Catherine Jones. Catherine Jones's story is that of a young girl forced into darkness who clawed her way back into the light, not to erase the past, but to transform its pain into purpose. At 13, she became embroiled in a tragic homicide that shocked Florida in 1999. But beyond the headlines and courtroom labels, Catherine's life reveals layers of trauma, resilience, and quiet redemption. Growing up alongside her brother Curtis, Catherine lived under the same roof as their father and his girlfriend Sonia Spates. Unbeknownst to many, the siblings endured years of alleged sexual abuse by a relative. These horrific experiences remained buried unaddressed by authorities meant to protect them. Without intervention, Catherine's young psyche was forced to absorb terror and helplessness, emotions she would carry into adulthood. On that fateful night, driven by terror rather than malice, Catherine joined Curtis in a desperate act, the killing of Sonia. They fled immediately, minds racing with confusion and fear. When courts branded them murderers, the narrative ignored their battered histories. Official filings barely scratched the surface of what they had endured. For Catherine, the courtroom's cold words, innocence, lost life sentence looming, felt like another blow to her spirit. In a plea agreement, she accepted responsibility for second-degree murder, resulting in an 18-year prison term plus lifelong probation. Still, this bargain was bittersweet. Freedom came later, but only with the label of convict permanently stamped on her life. Rehabilitation in prison is a difficult path, yet Catherine chose to walk it. Within concrete walls that offered little comfort, she engaged in therapy, leaned on education, and forged a relationship with faith. Though separated from Curtis due to institutional mandates, she carved out her own identity. Inside those walls, amid harsh routines, she learned empathy, resilience, and self-awareness. Her demeanor, reserved but reflective, spoke volumes about her inner journey. Letters home became her lifeline to the world she hoped to rejoin. Each carefully penned word, each confession of remorse or piecing together of memories reflected a profound introspection. She studied available courses, earning credits that later helped her adjust to life beyond prison. Underneath the sorrow and shame lay a woman determined not to remain tangled in her past. July 2015 was both liberation and reckoning. Catherine, 29, stepped outside as a free woman, but with a complicated past and no simple resolution. The weight of her experience pressed heavily. The stigma of her crime followed her like a shadow. Still, she chose healing over hiding. Unlike her brother, who became an ordained minister and public figure, Catherine embraced quieter forms of advocacy. She began volunteering, speaking privately in community workshops on child protection, trauma, and second chances. She understood better than most that systems designed to help children can also fail them, and that survivors sometimes become the strongest voices for change. Catherine's journey isn't one of sensational headlines or blockbuster redemption. Instead, it's marked by everyday courage, the kind that unfolds in whispers, resilience found in introspection, and transformation born from suffering. She refused to let her past define her future. Rather, she used it to shape a more compassionate life for others. Her story challenges us. How do we respond to children who commit lethal acts? Do we seek retribution, or do we dare to look behind the crime at the scars that produced it? Catherine's path suggests the latter. She isn't seeking pity or absolution. She's simply living a life shaped by regret but guided by growth. These stories of teens behind bars are not just about crime. They're about trauma, injustice, and the razor-thin line between punishment and compassion. From George Stinney Jr. to Catherine Jones, each case forces us to ask, did the system fail these children before they ever failed? Society. On Legends of Black Excellence, we spotlight the truth behind the headlines and the people history tried to forget. But what do you believe? Should these young offenders have been given another chance? Or were their actions simply unforgivable? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories.